Hello there. Welcome. You've arrived just in time, at the soft edge of night. Everything outside is beginning to dim, and it's safe here now, to close your eyes. Let the rest of the world go quiet. Tonight, we're returning to a land that moves very slowly. To a place of soft cobblestones and whispering hearths, where people wear wool cloaks and copper brooches, where bread is baked in clay ovens, and no one is ever in much of a hurry. This is the story of Alfredo, not the one from the battles or the scrolls, but Alfredo the Second, who ruled not with iron or fire, but with warmth, silence, and biscuits. You won't find him in many history books, but in the quiet margins between faded lines, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of his slippers, softly padding down a corridor of stone, past sleepy guards, into kitchens where nothing ever burns. This is a story about nothing urgent. It's about the little things, and how a very ordinary man became a very peaceful king. And it's yours now, so lie back, let go. We begin, as all good bedtime tales do, with the morning light on a mossy roof, and the gentle clatter of wooden spoons. Alfredo the Second didn't rise early, not because he was lazy, but because the kingdom didn't ask him to. You see, he ruled a very small piece of land, nestled in the folds of sleepy green hills, where clouds were just as important as taxes, and people greeted each other with warm loaves rather than laws. His bed was large, but simple, stuffed with straw and soft goat wool, framed in old wood passed down by generations of quiet rulers. The mattress creaked ever so slightly when he rolled over, but it was a friendly sort of creak, like a wooden voice saying, "Don't worry. You have time." A tiny dog, his companion named Pickle, was already awake, lying at the foot of the bed, dreaming of crumbs and chasing shoelaces. Pickle rarely barked, and when he did, it sounded like a yawn with opinions. Somewhere below, in the kitchens, the cook was preparing morning biscuits with thyme and honey. A slow clatter of wooden bowls, and the gentle tap of a butter knife against a dish. The smell would reach Alfredo in about 10 minutes, and when it did, he would smile in his sleep. He had only 3 royal duties that day. Taste the new batch of plum preserves. Approve a request to add a second bench to the village square. Host the annual Festival of Utterly Inoffensive Poetry. But for now, he stayed in bed a little longer, listening to the soft wind outside, brushing the old tapestries on the wall, each one stitched by hands no one remembered, telling stories of vegetables, quiet sheep, and a mythical chicken that once laid a sapphire egg. Outside, the sun was rising just enough to make the copper weather vane blink once, like it was winking at the world, saying, "You're all right, just as you are." And so was Alfredo. He finally stretched, slowly, like a bear that had read too many books, and rose to greet the day. In his slippers, of course.
Alfredo's feet touched the stone floor with the quiet shuff of old wool slippers. They were patched in 2 places, one with green thread, the other with blue, and embroidered with a very small, sleepy duck that no one but Pickle had ever noticed. He passed through the corridor slowly, its narrow windows letting in soft stripes of light that landed across faded tile. The castle wasn't large. It was more like a very sturdy cottage with aspirations. Along the way, he greeted a pot of lavender. He didn't speak to it, exactly. But he paused, bowed his head slightly, and admired how it had grown crooked, yet proud. By the time he reached the courtyard, the sun had settled into its gentle climb over the eastern hills. Warmth spread across the cobblestones like syrup over toast. And a small table had already been set for him under the apricot tree. It was a very polite tree. Old, with twisted limbs. And it had never once dropped fruit on anyone's head. At the table sat Marta, the castle's longtime cook and part-time harpist. She was setting down a jar of plum jam so thick it barely moved in the spoon. Next to it, soft goat cheese, still a little warm. Biscuits baked with rosemary and a single flake of salt atop each one. A pot of chamomile tea steaming gently beside a stack of honeycomb slices. drizzled with something called blossom drizzle, which might have been a recipe or simply a feeling. "Morning, your sleepiness," Marta said, with a grin that had lines at the edges. Alfredo nodded. He liked nicknames that sounded like naps. Pickle had already leapt onto the bench beside him, where he was offered a plate of crumbs and exactly one dried figure. He sniffed it suspiciously, then placed one paw over it, just in case. They ate slowly. Not for any particular reason. Just because there was no reason to eat quickly. They had all the time in the world. And the jam tasted better when admired first, garden gossip and royal duties. After breakfast, Alfredo walked the perimeter of the garden. It wasn't vast. Just a square patch of herbs, a tiny orchard, and some vines that had ambitions of becoming a hedge. The gardener, Tom, was already at work. He was a quiet man who only spoke in facts and vegetables. "Morning," he said. "The carrots have opinions today." Alfredo nodded solemnly. They walked together in companionable silence, occasionally pausing so Tom could show off an especially persuasive leek, or a row of suspiciously wiggly radishes. Neither of them had any strong opinions about the vegetables. They simply appreciated that they existed. Alfredo took note of a strawberry bush attempting to climb a wall. "I wish it luck," he said. Later, seated again under the apricot tree, he prepared for the day's only real task, the weekly royal audience. It wasn't as formal as it sounded. A handful of villagers would arrive, each with a small request or an update. Nothing urgent, nothing grand. Mina, the baker, asked permission to paint a sunflower on her shop sign. Alfredo asked what shade. "Mildly joyful yellow," she said. Approved, with a warm smile. Old Mr. Vindel brought a scroll asking for a second bench in the village square, citing the need for resting elbows after enthusiastic bread shopping. Also approved. The scroll was later returned with a tiny drawing of a bench and a cat on it. Finally, young Rowan, barely taller than a turnip sack, asked if the castle library had a book about clouds. He said he'd like to name them properly. Alfredo promised to look. And later that afternoon, he would write the names down himself, after the royal audience, which took less time than the average tea steeping. Alfredo put on his softest cloak, the one with the embroidered snail on the sleeve, and decided to take a walk to the market. Not for anything urgent, of course. He just liked the sound the flagstones made under his feet, and how the stalls looked when the sunlight caught their colorful fabrics. The town of Belmare, where he ruled, was more of a nap than a city. The buildings leaned ever so slightly as if trying to hear each other's dreams, and the people walked slowly, not because they were tired, but because they preferred to see things clearly as they passed. At the market, ribbons fluttered in the wind like lazy butterflies. A woman named Tess sold thread that shimmered in the light, and claimed it was spun from the size of content cats. No one questioned it. She tied a bit of gold thread around Alfredo's finger just for sparkle. He didn't take it off all day. The candle seller, an elderly man named Fen, had a voice like folding linen. His candles had names like warm socks on cloudy days, and library at noon. Alfredo purchased one called Smells Like a Poem About Strawberries, and tucked it carefully into his satchel. At the cheese stall, he tasted something new, a wheel so soft it nearly apologized when he cut into it. "I call it Sleepy Wheel," the cheesemaker said. "It's aged in a cave near some very mellow bees." He bought two. He lingered by the apothecary's cart, where dried herbs hung like sleeping birds. A jar labeled anti-fret dust caught his eye. When asked what it did, the apothecary simply said, "It reminds you that most things work out, eventually." Alfredo smiled. He didn't need it, but he bought it anyway.
After the royal audience, which took less time than the average tea steeping, Alfredo put on his softest cloak, the one with the embroidered snail on the sleeve, and decided to take a walk to the market. Not for anything urgent, of course. He just liked the sound the flagstones made under his feet, and how the stalls looked when the sunlight caught their colorful fabrics. The town of Belmare, where he ruled, was more of a nap than a city. The buildings leaned ever so slightly as if trying to hear each other's dreams, and the people walked slowly, not because they were tired, but because they preferred to see things clearly as they passed. At the market, ribbons fluttered in the wind like lazy butterflies. A woman named Tess sold thread that shimmered in the light, and claimed it was spun from the size of content cats. No one questioned it. She tied a bit of gold thread around Alfredo's finger, just for sparkle. He didn't take it off all day. The candle seller, an elderly man named Fen, had a voice like folding linen. His candles had names like warm socks on cloudy days, and library at noon. Alfredo purchased one called Smells Like a Poem About Strawberries, and tucked it carefully into his satchel. At the cheese stall, he tasted something new, a wheel so soft it nearly apologized when he cut into it. I call it Sleepy Wheel, the cheesemaker said. It's aged in a cave near some very mellow bees. He bought two. He lingered by the apothecary's cart, where dried herbs hung like sleeping birds. A jar labeled, anti-fret dust, caught his eye. When asked what it did, the apothecary simply said, it reminds you that most things work out, eventually. Alfredo smiled. He didn't need it, but he bought it anyway. By mid-afternoon, the villagers gathered in the town square for the festival. It wasn't a large event, nor especially organized, but it was one of Alfredo's favorites. The stage was a simple platform built from old library shelves. It creaked pleasantly when someone walked across it, and every performer was given a small cup of warm cider, and a daisy for luck. No judging, no prizes, only applause that sounded like light rain on window panes. The first poem was from Agnes, the blacksmith's sister. Her poem was about socks. Specifically, the joy of finding two that match, and the way your toes feel when they forget they're cold. Then came little Tallow, no older than 5, who stood on tiptoe and declared with great conviction, the moon is a potato. I saw it once. It didn't say anything. Applause thundered gently through the crowd. Next, Marta the cook offered a haiku about plum preserves. Sticky, sweet and gold, like time trapped in a glass jar, spread on quiet bread. Everyone sighed. Alfredo wiped away a crumb and gave a dignified nod. This was his favorite line of the afternoon. When it was Alfredo's turn, he stood slowly, stepped onto the stage, and read only one sentence. I like it when the wind forgets to hurry. And then he bowed, and sat back down. And someone, maybe Fen the candleman, whispered, that's a good one. After a light meal of cheese, bread, and a spoonful of Marta's soft tomato and lentil stew, Alfredo strolled back to the castle garden, where the apricot tree had waited patiently all day. The sun had moved just enough to cast a wide, friendly shadow, perfect for the simple cot laid out beneath its branches. The cot was a little uneven, but that only made it more comfortable somehow, as if one corner had decided to dream before the others. Pickle was already there, stretched out across a pillow like a particularly triumphant bread roll. He wagged his tail exactly once, then sighed, a soft, musical puff that sounded like the word, content. Alfredo eased himself down onto the cot. The moment he did, the breeze slowed. Not completely, just enough to rustle the apricot leaves in a pattern that suggested lullabies, or maybe half-remembered stories from when trees still spoke in full sentences. He rested his hands on his stomach, the way people do when they're done for the day, even if it's only the middle of the afternoon. Birds chirped quietly above, and bees, unbothered by kingdoms or poetry, buzzed from petal to petal. Time blurred. He dreamt of butter that never melted too quickly, and corridors lined with warm socks in alphabetical order. Pickle, meanwhile, twitched once in his sleep, perhaps chasing a noble snail. And the apricot tree held them both gently, as only an old, understanding tree can. Later, as the day leaned slowly toward twilight, Alfredo woke with that gentle confusion that only comes from very good naps. He yawned, stretched, and gave Pickle a scratch behind the ears, which earned a soft snort and a thump of the tail. Inside the castle, the library awaited. It wasn't a grand place. There were no towers of ancient scrolls or forbidden tomes. Just shelves made of crooked walnut wood, lined with journals, cookbooks, bestiaries, forgotten receipts, and a single book titled, The History of Nothing in Particular, which was checked out quite frequently. The librarian was named Seema. She had a way of making even her silence sound wise. Her spectacles were always slipping down her nose, and she kept a teacup on nearly every shelf, each one empty, except the one she always forgot she was drinking from. Alfredo arrived to find her halfway through rearranging the collection. Well? She asked, not looking up. Alphabetical, color-coded, or by how they feel in the hand? Whichever feels right, Alfredo replied. They sat at the round table in the center of the room. It was carved with symbols no one had ever fully translated, but everyone agreed they looked friendly. Seema poured tea, something spiced and floral, and they sipped in soft slurps between shared reading. Do you remember this? She asked, handing him a tiny booklet titled, Phrases for Encouraging Bread. Alfredo smiled. Yes, it helped me through a particularly disappointing loaf. They read passages aloud. One entry simply said, let it rise with confidence. For the next half hour, they spoke little. Only the soft turn of pages, the clink of porcelain, and the occasional chuckle when a recipe confused nutmeg with naval discipline. The candlelight grew long on the stone table, and neither of them noticed that the hour had crept so quietly upon them. By the time Alfredo stepped out into the garden again, the sky had turned to soft velvet. Not quite dark, not fully light, just the in-between, when things feel quiet and a little enchanted. The lantern garden came to life slowly. It wasn't a magical place, officially, but it had a way of knowing when people needed it most. Along the moss-lined path, hundreds of small paper lanterns swayed gently in the dusk breeze. Some hung from shepherd's hooks, others floated in shallow basins of water, casting golden rings that rippled across the stones. Each lantern had a story, or at least a memory, tucked inside by someone who once walked this path. One was for the baker's old cat, Flan. Another, for a very good batch of turnips from 4 summers ago. Alfredo lit a new one tonight. He wrote one sentence on a slip of parchment. Today felt full, even though nothing happened. He placed it inside the lantern, lit it with a flicker from a beeswax taper, and watched it glow softly, neither demanding nor announcing anything, just glowing. Pickle walked beside him, tail low and wagging lazily. He stopped to sniff a lantern shaped like a pear and sneezed once, gently. Along the walk, Alfredo greeted the plants by name. The drowsy lavender, the thoughtful fennel, and a particularly bashful marigold that always bloomed facing the hedge. They didn't answer, but somehow, he felt heard anyway. Up above, the first stars appeared, soft, white glimmers in a lavender sky. Alfredo named them quietly to himself. Not the scientific names, just his own. The Big Buttercup, the Wandering Biscuit, and, of course, Snuggle Sparkle Minor. The wind grew a little cooler, and Pickle leaned against his shin as they turned back. The castle windows glowed now like sleepy eyes, watching their king return, soft steps and all. Back inside, the castle was wrapped in a hush. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that feels full, like a blanket pulled up over your shoulders. Alfredo made his way to the quietest room. It wasn't officially called that, but everyone knew which room it was. No doors creaked there. No books ever fell from shelves. Even Pickle seemed to breathe softer within its walls. It had one window, with a round pane of old glass that bent the moonlight slightly, so it always looked like it was smiling. The bed was turned down, a warm brick wrapped in cloth at the foot. Marta had left a small cup of warm cider on the side table, and beside it, a note that read, "Tonight's stars are particularly cozy. Sleep accordingly." He smiled. On the table was his nightly book, a tattered volume titled, Unimportant Adventures of Remarkably Unbusy People. He opened to a bookmarked page, and read aloud, softly, as Pickle curled into a donut shape beside him. Chapter 7. Horace builds a fence, but only gets halfway before taking a nap. It was a good fence. Or at least, it was going to be. He chuckled once. A soft, kind sound that made the candle flame blink. He took a sip of cider, let the warmth pool behind his ribs, then set the cup down, pulled the blanket over himself, and blew out the candle with one easy puff. Darkness, then, but not empty. Just full of breath, warmth, and the very gentle creak of settling stone. There are no grand endings in Belmare, no trumpets, no fanfare, only warm rooms, quiet books, and soft cider to carry you through the night. Alfredo the Second ruled not through command or ceremony, but by making sure the jam was always sweet, the chairs always had cushions, and the people had enough time to stop and wave at the stars. As the moon drifted higher, and the crickets hummed a lullaby known only to the gardens, Alfredo slept. Pickles snored once, just loud enough to remind the world that some dogs dream with their whole hearts. Outside, the apricot tree rustled once in the wind, and somewhere far off, a single lantern still glowed quietly in the water, reminding no one in particular that peace isn't something you find, it's something you build slowly, one nap, one biscuit, and one poem about socks at a time. And so the kingdom of quiet things slept too, holding all its warm light gently, just like you are now, drifting, breathing slow, safe, and softly, asleep.